Damon, thanks so much for joining us. Really grateful for this opportunity for you to be part of this series. Let me start with a problem that we all see, and that is backsliding within democracies. We see it on the European continent, we see it elsewhere. What can we do to address this backsliding, and how, whether it's on Europe or anywhere else, how do we address this problem so that democracies can actually work together more effectively?
Well, thank you, David. It's a real pleasure to be with you and the Bush Institute. So thank you for having me on. You're right that we're not only in what we all well know as the 16th year of a democratic recession, but it's characterized by some things that are different from the past. And one of them really is a sense of democratic erosion. It's backsliding in established democracies. And it's really, I think, a product of the age that we're in, an age in which there are a lot of incentives that fuel political polarization. The way that the information space, technology operate with our politics is fueling a sense of polarization in developed democracies where we're seeing incentives that have led to the chipping away of civic space and democratic liberties. Whether in Europe, we have our own populist bout in the United States, or in large established democracies from Brazil to India. It's a real challenge in the nature of the global phenomenon we face right now. And so part of getting this right around the world, how do we have a sense of democratic renewal around the world, really has to start with established democracies and a sense of understanding, a re-anchoring of the values and the principles that really underpin a democratic culture. And I think that's what's important. It's not just about sort of the institutions and the procedures, but how do we actually think of nurturing a democratic culture? We do need to acknowledge this populist bout we're in, but ultimately it is the reality of a system that is tied to responsiveness of its people that can be subject to the whims of populism, but has that built-in manner of self-correction. And so we can't be complacent at all and expect this is self-correcting, but it's the nature of individuals in free societies to be able to protest, argue, bicker, and to use their systems to help fix these issues. And so getting democratic renewal around the world right begins with strengthening democracy among established democracies, just as you hear from our public debates here in the United States.
One of our biggest allies in this are of course, European countries, and we and the Europeans have played a critical role in supporting democratic transitions in many places, not just on the European continent, of course. Europe is experiencing some tremendous turmoil right now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, some backsliding, of course, in places like Hungary. How can Europe stay as a solid ally and partner with us in supporting democracy around the world?
Well, look, Europe with North America, it needs to be the spine, the backbone of the free world, if you will. Europe, the European Union, after all, is the greatest peace project on this planet. Taking a continent that had a history of just bloody conflicts, binding them together in a great peace project. To some degree, that led to almost a postmodern view in Europe of the world that Vladimir Putin has very much shattered. And I think, yes, while we've been concerned about issues within European democracies, I think Vladimir Putin's extreme, abject, uh, unprovoked attack on Ukraine, the crushing of dissent at home in Russia, the intimidation of his neighbors, the coercion of European countries has finally helped, I think, provoke a sense of awakening. And you see this most prominently in a country like Germany, uh, that democracy on the continent is something they can't take for granted. It does require that investment in their defense. It does require an assertiveness of protecting their own democracies and democratic institutions. It requires standing up to Vladimir Putin's Russia. And it namely is all about mobilizing support for where the battle for freedom is right now. And that's front and center in Ukraine. And so it is the tragedy and sacrifice of Ukrainians as they struggle to protect their freedom that I think is beginning to stiffen the spine of Europe to understand that you can't take this for granted. We're not out of the clear. We are still in a knife fight, if you will, for freedom. But I think there are more Europeans now that understand that they really have to be in the arena not just observers to this process, but they've got to go front and center in this battle.
Let me just squeeze in one more question and then turn it over to Chris. Damon, on when it comes to China, do you think we in Europe can be on the same page when it comes to the problems of anti-democratic authoritarian behavior, the crackdown on human rights, the genocide against the Uyghurs? Is there a potential to come together between U.S. and Europe on this, do you think?
Absolutely. I think if you look at it today, you can be frustrated sometimes when there are differences of approaches. But if you have the perspective of looking out how this has evolved over the past 20 years, when I served in government, we were working to get the EU to have an arms embargo on the Communist Party of China. We were talking about, why are you selling weapons to a country that could use them against Americans or our allies? Man, we have come a long way. But it doesn't mean that we're through the clear. Part of what, as you hear from President Biden articulating the importance of democracy versus autocracy, is to really think about democracy as strategy. And I think this is where the Europeans and the Americans have a lot of burden to come together to understand that democracy isn't a value, but it's a principle that needs to be consistent with our values and our interests, woven through all of our policies. And so, dealing with China, we need to have a common approach from the free world on how to deal with a communist China, how to have a geoeconomic strategy that's built upon reliable democracies, and marrying that sense of democracy not just as a value, but as part of our strategy. And that first and foremost begins with a concerted approach to check China's authoritarian march. It's an export of the tools, tactics, and strategies of repression, and calling out and standing by the Chinese people, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the Hong Kongers, who have lost their freedom inside China.
Damon, I really appreciated the image you created of the transatlantic alliance being the spine of supporting democracy around the world. And obviously, there are other regions in South America, in Asia, where there are strong democracies as well that are part of our alliance. How does that group, do you think, help support nations who are transitioning to democracy?
So I think it's both delivering on our values and our interests together, and it's an approach that I think has really been misunderstood or manipulated. The importance of civil societies to have the right to assist other civil societies as part of what I represent, the National Endowment for Democracy. The issue isn't how Europeans and Americans can instruct and direct others in democracy. That's not the point at all. It's recognizing the universal aspiration for individual liberties, for dignity. That demand for democracy is resilient around the world, and what we simply need to do is to be there and to support it. How can we support those on the front lines of the struggle for their own freedom, who are working to promote their own democratic cultures and institutions? And how can we support them in their context, in their struggle? That's where the NED is front and center. That's where our partners at the European Endowment for Democracy are really important, but also many of the democracies themselves across the transatlantic space, increasingly understanding that in government policies, how do they bolster and support other democracies when they are under duress? When China launches a trade war against Australia or pressures and intimidates Lithuania, how are the transatlantic democracies working together immediately in solidarity with those other democracies? How are they using their overseas development assistance in a way that is supporting human dignity and justice, that is supporting the aspirations of people around the world? And given the substantial role that these countries play as donors, I think that approach of being confident in the values that underpin a democratic support, that's important, combined with a really heavy dose of humility and recognizing that it's not meant to be a made in Brussels or Washington plan, but really the responsibility to support Democrats around the world in their own struggle and aspirations. And that's where the United States and Europe working together can play a key role.
I really appreciate that explanation. Thanks for walking through it. But when you think about that support going to countries, what conditions do you think have to be there on the ground in order for that to help that transition occur?
This is an important question, but also one that we can overthink to some degree, because it's not like these transitions are to be directed and orchestrated through a plan that we have here in Washington. That's not the reality. That's not how this works. fundamentally, it is about tapping the potential of individuals to be able to determine their own destiny. And so, part of what I'm really proud about in the endowment, the National Endowment for Democracy, is that we have a global footprint, a global infrastructure. This is what President Reagan called for in the Westminster Address: was how can there be a global infrastructure to support the cause of freedom, recognizing that it is really hard to tell and hard to know when there might be a democratic breakthrough. And yet, that investment in the individuals, the people that are able to be those change agents, being consistent in that struggle is something that the endowment does, because we don't pick a time. We don't know when historic windows open. But to have stood by and supported those that are going to be the agents of change, then we know that there will be leaders and individuals that will help to create those opportunities, help ensure that they succeed. Part of this is also understanding that it's not just about values. It is about showing how democracy delivers, how there can be good governance, how it goes along with a commitment to fighting corruption and kleptocracy. If you look at a lot of the failed transitions in the past, why is China communist today? And it's because of the kleptocracy and corruption that sapped the legitimacy of nationalists at the time. We see modern forms of that all around the world. And so I think that's a big part of the equation, Chris.
Well, let me try to end on an optimistic note. What nations do you think have managed a transition to democracy well, and how have they done that?
Well, look, if you stay focused in Europe, we can't take for granted what's happened. We've seen an incredibly radical transformation of Europe in which former adversaries have become allies. 115 million people formerly trapped in captive nations in the bonds of communism now have their freedom secured within the NATO alliance. That is a historic development. Even as you look beyond Central and Eastern Europe and Poland, the Czech Republic, and these countries, as you look into Moldova, as you look into Ukraine, despite the difficulty of today, it's a pretty remarkable success story as you see a pro-reform government in little Moldova trying to keep the country anchored in the free world in difficult circumstances. If you see a Ukraine today, the reason Ukraine has resisted and successfully Russia's invasion is not because it's had amazing leadership over the years, but because democracy has allowed a proliferation of agency of its people. It's developed the civil society infrastructure, the sense that individuals have a say in their life, a decentralization that's empowered local authorities. And so, despite corruption or despite uneven political leadership, the resiliency of Ukrainian democracy is what Mr. Putin didn't understand, and what has been a huge part of the equation of stopping Russian forces. But you've also seen breakthroughs in places like Zambia and Malawi and Africa that are often really overshadowed. And you've got turmoil in places that could lead to significant change, as we see the difficulties in Sri Lanka today. But it's people challenging a family dynasty that was in bed through corruption with the Chinese. And so, not clear where some of these transitions will immediately lead, but shows that the demand for dignity and demand for democracy, it's robust, it's resilient, and we're in an era of protest where we need to help support people, not just with the opportunity to change and support democracy in their countries, but to ensure that those democracies can deliver for their people and therefore be sustainable.
That we face challenges here at home in the United States. And for those of us in this field, we hear a lot of whataboutism when other countries say, yeah, but your problems too on elections, media, and so on. How do you deal with that as you travel around the world, as you engage with civil society activists and government officials and others? How do you address that problem?
Look, this is the path of democracy is not linear. I'm a gay man that grew up in South Carolina with Jim Clyburn, an African American, is I'm actually right here in Charleston, just outside his district. He comes to South Carolina and he says, look, we need to understand that he quotes de Tocqueville in South Carolina, which is beautiful, saying America's not the most enlightened country necessarily, but it has an ability better than most to repair its faults. And we repair our faults because we don't need Chinese propaganda to tell us about our shortcomings. That's what we do in democracies. We're introspective. We hold ourselves accountable. We debate. We argue. these are painful issues, and you see it in the evolution of the American democracy front and center. There are no rose-colored glasses in imagining how we've evolved. But at the same time, that's powerful. It's beautiful. And that's the simplicity of what we're trying to stand by for other people, to be able to make their own mistakes, but to have a built-in system that can repair its own faults. And so I believe I own this sense of struggle in the United States. I own that because I think it actually gives us a needed dose of humility to say, we're not here to tell you what to do. We're here to stand in solidarity with you in your own struggle, whether you're in the jungles of Burma trying to resist a junta, or whether you're struggling under the repression of Daniel Ortega's Nicaragua right now. It's for us to stand in solidarity with those who are struggling on the front lines, who know best how to do this in their country. And we can do it by owning our own struggles. And this is the beauty. It's the power of democracy. We don't need outsiders to make us embarrassed or us accountable. It's what we do to ourselves, 2 steps forward, 1 step back at times. But ultimately, it's why democracy is strong and resilient. And I believe we are on a journey towards a more perfect union over time. And it's why authoritarians are brittle, unpredictable, and more fragile than people think.
Well, Damon Wilson, that is a terrific note to end on. President of the National Endowment for Democracy, we are grateful that you were able to spend some time with us for this Democracy Talk series. Thanks so much. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for all the Bush Institute does. It's a pleasure being with you today.